For the Washington Examiner, I'm Siraj Hashmi, and this is Hashing It Out. I'm joined by TYT correspondent Emma Vigeland, and she's joining us right now from hunkered down in New Jersey right now. Emma, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Obviously, a lot of news outside of the coronavirus pandemic. There has been a large amount of developments happening in the 2020 presidential race in the Democratic primary. But before we really get into that, as you've been with the TYT network for several years, and you've been covering the progressive movement pretty much as it's been bubbling to the mainstream through Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But first of all, what do you think most people don't understand about the progressive movement?
Well, I think that what most people don't understand is that while the politicians who are representative of that movement have a hard time kind of breaking through, we just saw that with Bernie Sanders, who pretty much collapsed. And then also how divisive Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, other progressives like Ilhan Omar are presented in the media. The ideas are actually quite mainstream. So, in most polls, Medicare for All polls above water over 50%, Green New Deal polls very well, also above 50% in many polls. Just many of the progressive priorities are very popular with the American public, let alone the Democratic electorate. So when you see these exit polls where people voted for Joe Biden, Medicare for All surged in popularity, especially as the coronavirus pandemic raged on. But it's the perception of the politicians, much driven by the media and the establishment of the party, that hinders the movement more than anything, because the ideas, if it was just about that, we'd be taking over the Democratic Party yesterday.
And I mean, when you strip it all down and look at its core of the progressive movement, what exactly is the movement trying to achieve? What's their main goal?
Human dignity. I think that over the past few decades, I don't think this is kind of fact, corporations, wealthy people have dominated the legislative goals in Congress. And that's in large part due to the overwhelming amount of money in politics, which has only increased since the 70s, 80s, 90s. And, I think it's the under-discussed element of 2016 where Trump talked about how he was self-funded, how the Democratic Party was corrupt. Hillary Clinton shamelessly took money from Wall Street, big money donors, and Trump was a brick through that establishment window. That's what many people perceived him as, and he said he wasn't going to be like that he would drain the swamp. Now, I believe he was a complete liar, but that doesn't mean that the perception wasn't there. So I think the movement overall is to actually drain the swamp, in a sense, to create policies and push forward policies that are pro-human being, that allow for human dignity, healthcare for all, combating climate change, aggressively a $15 minimum wage, criminal justice reform, policy goals above all. And the reason that there are so many barriers is because of those very institutionalized things that I just discussed when it comes to money.
How integral would you say Bernie Sanders is to the progressive movement?
The most integral. We wouldn't have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who I think a lot of people see as the future of the movement, without Bernie Sanders. And I find it frustrating when I talk to kind of casual liberals who hate Bernie Sanders but love AOC. And it's a lot to do with the fact that, there is this blind hatred of him in the media. And, you watch MSNBC, it's like they hate Bernie Sanders more than Trump. Maybe I wouldn't go that far, because I can see why some Trump supporters get frustrated, because it's almost like the CNNs and MSNBCs of the world have kind of been given new life because of Trump, and they've made this cottage industry of just churning out outrage about Trump. And it doesn't really matter what he does. I think 95% of what he does is outrageous, but there's no degree to outrage. So say he tweets something terrible, that's the same amount of degree of outrage as the fact that he didn't prepare this country for a global pandemic and downplayed it for months and weeks. So the fact that there's no degree to that, I think, really undercuts them. But to not to get off topic there, Bernie Sanders is integral. We wouldn't, the House adopted a $15 minimum wage because of him, and now almost every major presidential candidate was advocating for it. Medicare for all, every debate we heard, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? They talked about that policy specifically as the benchmark for progressive healthcare policy, and that's Bernie Sanders' bill. So he's transformed the discussion. He's redefined what Americans think is possible from their government. And I think he'll go down as one of the most important politicians of the 21st century. And it's a shame that I think he was done really dirty, but.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk a little bit about his presidential runs, because obviously in 2016, that was his breakthrough right there. I mean, take us through his presidential campaigns and this particular cycle. What do you think he did differently this time around in 2020 compared to 2016?
Well, I think in many ways, when you read some of these postmortems, he doubled down on some of his poorer instincts from 2016, just to get into the negatives. He did not attack Hillary Clinton enough in 2016, in my view. He said, don't talk about her damn emails, right? That was the famous phrase.
You think he should have?
Sorry?
Do you think that he should have?
I do. I think he should have been more aggressive about it. But I think he's naturally non-combative as a human being. And then we see that he didn't want to attack Joe Biden. You read the Politico piece, the HuffPost piece, where they spoke to his team. They had teed up things for him at the debate to go after Joe Biden for telling his donors nothing would fundamentally change. Bernie refused to do it. He just went back to his similar policy talking points. He does not have a killer instinct when it comes to attacking fellow Democrats or Democratic politicians, specifically ones that he likes. I think Joe Biden being kind to him in the Senate when there were a lot of people who saw him as a crazy loon, I think that played a role in why he didn't feel like he wanted to go after him that aggressively. And also he has this PTSD from the media constantly telling him that he was the reason Trump won. You're the reason Trump won. He did not want to be blamed for it. But what he doesn't realize is they're going to blame him anyway, and his supporters anyway, no matter what happens, when I think Biden will likely lose in the fall. So, that's my take on it. I think that was one of his more fatal flaws. And additionally, the Clyburn endorsement was huge when we look back on it. He did not do enough to reach out to older Black voters. He made a lot of inroads with younger Black voters. He won in those areas, and he won and made huge gains with Latino voters, which, by the way, will be huge in a general election, as will young people. Those are some of the most important voters in the country. But, he could have done more, and the fact that he did not make that his focus and see that Clyburn could have maybe been swayed in that area, because you look at the exit polling, a huge percentage of people say that was a huge factor in their final decision, and that was the eventual nail in the coffin, because then Obama made his calls. Pete Buttigieg, Klobuchar, Beto O'Rourke, all of them congealed behind Joe Biden, pushed him forward, and then Bernie Sanders, it was lights out.
Yeah, I recall watching some of your takes on say the Super Tuesday postmortem and how the coalescing behind Biden was legit. You don't think there was any, say, like foul play with the DNC, like we saw in 2016, where they were sort of tipping the scales for Hillary versus Bernie at the time?
Oh, certainly. I don't think it was as egregious. I mean, as Debbie Wasserman Schultz's leadership, Tom Perez deserves some credit for not being completely bought and paid for by the Hillary campaign. I mean, Hillary for America, or the Hillary Victory Fund, I'm blanking on which one, was keeping the DNC's literal lights on, because Obama had incentivized these consultants to continue to be getting paid even in off years, and the DNC was running on fumes financially, and then Hillary Clinton was literally paying them and had says in their staff and in their direction. So the idea that was a fair primary is ludicrous to anyone who's objectively observing the situation. It was a little bit different this time around, because I think they realized how insane that was. But of course, the Democratic establishment for the second presidential cycle in a row has put way more energy into defeating Bernie Sanders than into finding an adequate candidate to go against Donald Trump. I mean, I obviously think Bernie Sanders would be the best candidate against Trump because you offer his left-wing populism versus his faux right-wing populism. And now we have a guy like Joe Biden who, I'm very concerned about his cognitive decline and how that's going to play in the general.
That's a quick follow-up to that, because I always get the sense that the Democratic Party, or at least the Democratic establishment, and as you say, they put more energy towards defeating Bernie Sanders than they do to Donald Trump. It's almost as if that they care more about maintaining power over the party than they are about maintaining power over the country. Do you kind of get that sense or that feeling?
I don't know if it's conscious, but I think you're spot on in terms of really what they are thinking unconsciously. Perhaps it can't be Bernie, it can't be Bernie, it can't be Bernie. And part of the problem is because they know he would fundamentally change things for everyone who's making decisions. The DNC would no longer be this slushy consultant fund. The DNC would actually have to respond to voters and would have to institute and push forward the policies, and not the DNC specifically, but the Democratic Party as a whole, that are so popular. I mean, they're basically these gatekeepers. They're holding up the castle walls as the people are trying to push them down, because they know that this is going to upset the power structures that literally pay them, give them campaign donations. It's their entire way of life would have to change. A lot of consultants, a lot of campaign workers, a lot of Democratic Party operatives would have to leave and do other things. It threatens their livelihoods. And I think that that's underreported, because Bernie Sanders would make it a populist movement. He would make it a populist party. We saw in 2016, right? Like the Republican Party obviously didn't want Donald Trump to be elected. The power structure, and we saw, Jeb Bush, George W. Bush came out, Mitt Romney. There was a lot of people trying to stop that, but the Republican Party doesn't have super delegates. They don't have party elites making these decisions. And once the base wanted him, they allowed him through, and it worked out for them, to be honest. So the Democratic Party, though, it's like, honestly, just this rotten carcass. And I feel like this was I thought 2016 was their last gasp, but it might be 2020.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because that was a similar thought about how, in 2016, when the Republican Party was looking to take out Trump, they didn't coalesce behind one establishment candidate. That, like, everyone took their individual turns trying to take him out, and then he just picked them off one by one. So I mean, it's pretty weird how this has all happened. And I mean, Bernie Sanders stepped out of the race after the Wisconsin primary on April 7th. Do you think that was a smart political move on his part to do that?
No. Again, I'm much more in favor of what I've seen out of Representative Ocasio-Cortez, who has held off on her endorsement of Joe Biden. We know it's inevitable. We know, but she's keeping her powder dry in a sense. She's going to use her political capital, which is now enormous, when she feels it's right. And it blows my mind that in that New York Times piece, she said that the Biden campaign hasn't even called her. And that reeks of similar arrogance of 2016. I think Biden's going to try to rectify some of those things. And what's fascinating to me is I feel like Hillary Clinton was more hostile to the left, but was more of a leftist. I know this is the lowest bar imaginable, than Joe Biden. When Hillary was in the Senate, she tried some more progressive things. When she was first lady, she tried to tried to reform healthcare. Joe Biden, in his entire career, has fetishized being in the center of the political spectrum. In fact, has fetishized working with Republicans, even when he was Obama's vice president. And Obama would keep giving Republicans 90% of what they wanted, and they still despised him. Joe Biden continues to believe that this is the correct way to go about things. So while Biden, I think, will be more open to listening, as a legislator, or as a leader, excuse me, I cannot imagine that he would be prioritizing leftist principles at all.
Do you think, I mean, obviously there's talk about whether Bernie Sanders should have taken it to convention, but what do you think factored into his calculus to step aside and pave the way for Biden to capture the nomination?
Yeah, so I touched on this a little. I do think, look, I think Bernie Sanders is a fundamentally decent man. And even people on the right who've worked with him say that. I think that he personally has a good relationship with Joe Biden. They're friends. He did not want to do a barn burning thing, tear him down. And I know that from New York Times reporting that Obama made a bunch of calls and they had 4 separate conversations. So there were conversations with Obama discussing how basically we have to defeat Trump, we have to go behind Biden, blah blah blah. And I think Bernie Sanders was tired and he saw the writing on the wall. There's almost only so much fighting that a man can do against an establishment that it just doesn't want him. And I'll make a separate point about Bernie Sanders as a candidate. He would have been so much better set up to win a general election than he was ever to win the Democratic primary. The Democratic primary for him, it's a lot of true blue voters, a lot of MSNBC watchers, and those people have been constantly told that Bernie Sanders can't win, that he's dangerous, that he's bad, blah, blah, blah. They're not people who we need to win over in the general election, right? They're going to vote for the Democratic candidate no matter who it is, those Joe Biden's base. Bernie Sanders would have turned out young people, would have turned out non-voters who are traditionally poorer, non-white, people who actually want to see a system change and who are disaffected by both parties. That's what he would do. I don't know who Joe Biden turns out besides the people he's already won over in the Democratic primary. And so that's what concerns me deeply.
So yeah, focusing a little bit more on Joe Biden, because there's obviously been this talk about what does he do to reach out to the progressive movement or Bernie Sanders' base. In your view, what does he have to do, say, campaign strategy wise, with respect to staffing, messaging, outreach to bring the progressive movement into the fold and actually try to turn? He's not going to turn all of them out, but at least turn some of them out.
See, that's a tough question because I don't know if progressives would believe Joe Biden no matter what. I mean, putting the Medicare age at 60, that's not going to turn millennial progressives out. He has to, I think, make a splash with his vice presidential pick. And I think he actually has to talk as more of a leftist in the general election than he did in the primary. That's what's so topsy-turvy about this, is like, when you're looking at the general, the Democratic primary voters are almost to the right in certain ways of the general electorate, because the general apolitical voters are populists to their core. And Joe Biden is not a populist, obviously. And Trump gets to run now with an incumbency advantage, but as the populist as well, which is scary. So I think Biden does have to actually take the left seriously, not make a general election pivot where I don't even know how much further right he could go in the general election to actually distinguish himself. He might need to actually substantively pivot to the left, adopt a climate change policy that isn't just, we'll go back to the Paris Accord, show people how he's going to substantively change their lives, because that's how you win. You win with a strong message, no matter what it is, right, left, you win with a strong message. The last Democratic president who won, Obama, ran to the left of Hillary Clinton, the more establishment favorite. I have very low hopes for Joe Biden, to be honest, in 2020, but I will say that in this pandemic, anything is possible. We thought that in Wisconsin, the turnout depression would certainly favor the Republicans and their candidate would win that Supreme Court election, and the opposite happened. So it's very hard to prognosticate at this point.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to see that, as you mentioned before, how topsy-turvy this all is, because typically when you run, say, for example, in the Democratic primary, you run to the left and then you moderate during the general election. It seems to be the almost the polar opposite that we're seeing right now. But in terms of actual policies, of course, Biden isn't going to embrace every single progressive policy, but what would you say is maybe the one primary policy that he could embrace, whether it be genuinely or just simply to cater towards progressive voters, that would actually help him, or at least move the needle in the direction of growing his base a little bit?
So he said in like on his website and in principle that he wants single payer healthcare. He needs to go on the stump and say single payer healthcare. He's not going to go for Medicare for all. I get it. Or public option, whatever. Sorry, I misspoke. Public option is on his website. He's not going to go for a single payer system. But just public option, dude. Put that out there. Put that front and center. Make your case policy wise, and then you can bring some people in. The return to normalcy is like such a flimsy political strategy. I just don't have faith in it, especially when, and I point this out not to be mean, but to be realistic. Biden is having trouble speaking and is perhaps cognitively declining. In a pandemic where people are terrified, they want a strong leader. They want to rally behind the leader. Biden not being able to give a coherent message is bad news for him. And people are going to maybe be more responsive to Trump, who's now signing his name on checks and sending them out to people, than they are going to be behind a guy who they don't have confidence in mentally. So I think it's tough. He has to put himself out there, but I fear when he puts himself out there more, that more of these gaffes are going to happen, and not gaffes of old like Joe Biden, when he swore after Obamacare was passed on the hot mic. Not like that. Like legitimate potential cognitive decline gaffes, which are really, really bad when we're facing a national crisis like this.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and it's almost become a taboo topic, really, to talk about a potential president's mental fitness. I think you've seen it at least within, with respect to President Trump. Every time, say, for example, you have an armchair psychologist start to speculate about the mental fitness of President Trump, conservatives and Trump supporters kind of get up in arms and say, how dare you? But now we're seeing Joe Biden with this, and I think you're starting to see that with respect to his mental state or his mental fitness, it seems to be a bit more of a legitimate question. Do you kind of feel that way, that at least like it's okay to at least question their mental fitness regardless of which party they tend to affiliate with?
Absolutely, because what's frustrating is when the media deems a topic taboo, it doesn't mean that regular people aren't going to talk about it. The number one suggested search when I search Joe Biden is Joe Biden Alzheimer's. Like, people have speculated about Trump doing Adderall. All of this stuff, like, it doesn't go away just because the media decides to not talk about it. That's why people go to alternative media online, is because they will touch on these topics that are actually concerning people. You saw Joe Rogan literally saying this guy can't form a sentence. It's the most listened to guy in America.
Right.
You think just because CNN and MSNBC have now collectively decided not to talk about Joe Biden not being able to say things coherently, you think that that's going to go away? It's not. It's not. The people are just going to turn to online sources for those things. And so that's what delegitimizes the media in people's eyes. That's why a few weeks ago, the Gallup poll about the response to the coronavirus, Trump had a 16-point lead on the mainstream media, or on media in general. Is the media going to reckon with that? Are they going to make a decision to actually be a little bit more honest? And sorry, just to finish this point, they were talking about it during the primary. Andrea Mitchell was talking about it on NBC. Julian Castro very pointedly pointed it out during the debate. So they're now just choosing not to talk about it, which makes them look even worse.
Additionally, all these allegations of sexual harassment, sexual assault that Joe Biden has faced, specifically with the most recent one of Tara Reid, whether you actually want to discuss and debate the merits of it and whether it actually happened, it seems like more of a he said, she said type of deal. But you kind of see at least within the New York Times and within some of these mainstream outlets, that they don't believe it. Well, they cast the level of scrutiny on those allegations that they probably didn't benefit to, say, Brett Kavanaugh in 2018. I just want to get your thoughts on whether you think, this should, that double standard currently exists, especially within the Me Too and Time's Up movements.
Certainly. And as someone who was harassed pretty habitually and felt that Me Too empowered me to kind of realize that, I've just compartmentalized it and pretended it didn't exist. I'm really disheartened to see a lot of people in the movement just just kind of be so hypocritical about this. The fact patterns with Brett Kavanaugh and with what happened allegedly with Joe Biden, they're fairly similar in terms of like how much evidence there is. And so I don't see the disparity there. Now you can say, okay, in hindsight, maybe we were a little too, the pendulum swung a little too far in the Me Too movement, right? In the sense that we saw this with Aziz Ansari, where those allegations were ridiculous, and it was a bad date, and he was getting assassinated in the media about it. Yeah, but now we're going to be a little bit more judicious with these accusations, but that's not the case. Brett Kavanaugh and the allegations against Joe Biden, those two things, they're pretty close, but now they're just saying, oh, Russia, oh, she did this to this. She first gave her story to a leftist online podcaster, Katie Halper, which great work by her. No, she actually tried to get her story out there at least a year ago, and Time's Up basically silenced her and gave her some legal runaround and saying that that she couldn't speak out. I mean, I'm baffled by the New York Times' disparity in the way that they treated the Kavanaugh allegations and the way that they're treating the Biden allegations now. And again, just because the media isn't going to be talking about it, and just because they're pretending it doesn't exist, doesn't mean that online it's not going to be discussed and it's not going to be whispered about neighbor to neighbor, which is the number one reason that things get into people's consciousness. Whatever.
Well, Emma Vigeland, TYT correspondent, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.